Depends on if you have a deal or not. If you do not have a deal and you do not have a blind pool set up, then they're not sending funds. You only send funds if you have the deal and the private placement memorandum, the operating agreement, the subscription agreement, and the investor qualifier done and ready for them to complete. So that is the paperwork that is required. Those 4 things I just said. Those are the 4 things required for the investor to invest in a deal. So again, the private placement memorandum, otherwise known as a PPM, the operating agreement, the subscription agreement, and the investor qualifier. And so investor qualifier, the purpose of that is to simply qualify the investor as an accredited investor if you're only taking accredited investors. The subscription agreement simply states that they're subscribing to a certain amount of shares. So basically they're buying a certain amount of shares in the LLC that owns the property. The operating agreement outlines everything that it's an LLC operating agreement, so it outlines the payment order, who gets paid when, the manager, the members, any type of legal language that needs to be in there, the bios for the people who are participating on the general partnership side, and a lot of other things. Then the PPM is basically a disclosure document that mentions all the different ways that the deal could go wrong. Mm-hmm. It's there to properly educate the investors about what could happen, and it's about at least 100 pages long, and it has stuff that is very obscure, but it happened at some point in time in the history of these deals, so they had to include that one example. So those are the 4 documents, and if you don't have a deal though, then you're not getting investor funds. And as far as a tip for if you don't have a deal yet, but you are having investor conversations, because I tend to think, based on how this question was phrased, this individual was wondering, if I don't have a deal yet, but I want to get investors committed, what type of paperwork do they submit? Well, nothing that's binding, certainly, nothing that's binding, but what you could do, and I've seen this done, you could have a simple commitment document, a 1-page commitment document that says, I'm committing to investing in X amount of dollars, and that would be signed by that investor, and it's not it's not worth the paper that it's printed on from a legal standpoint, mm-hmm. but psychologically, they might be more vested in your deals if they have that. Another way, because ultimately, starting out, you might get a lot of yeses, but when you actually have a deal, then they might disappear because people were just being nice to you, or because then whenever they really go to invest their hard-earned money, they're like, well, do I want to invest in someone who's starting out? Mm-hmm. You could also make sure that they're accredited, because accredited investors are more likely to invest than non-accredited, because they have more disposable income than unaccredited investors. So you could ask them, are you accredited, and make sure that you have that conversation prior to you presenting to them a deal, because if they're not accredited, then unless you're doing I think it's 506C, I get them mixed up, 506B and 506C, and by the way, best ever listeners, go to multifamilysyndication.com, and I interviewed someone who does securities, and he outlined the difference between 506B and 506C. But unless you're doing one of those that takes non-accredited investors, then you need to stick to accredited.